What makes this situation linger uncomfortably in the public conversation is not the act of choosing separate bedrooms, which in any ordinary household would barely warrant a passing comment, but the way this detail has been gently leaked, framed, defended, explained, and then re-explained, as though the public needed a tutorial on how to interpret it correctly, and that alone signals a level of carelessness in image management that is difficult to ignore. Because when people who trade so heavily on symbolism, tradition, and controlled appearances suddenly allow something this intimate to be discussed through expert commentary and lifestyle justification, it reveals far more than intended, not about sleep science, but about anxiety over perception. And once perception anxiety creeps in, every carefully placed explanation begins to feel like overcompensation rather than confidence. And that is where the narrative slips from harmless lifestyle choice into a quiet self-own, because confident couples rarely feel the need to outsource validation of their private arrangements to academics, dating app founders, and relationship coaches. Yet here we are, reading a full-blown defense campaign for something that supposedly doesn't matter, which paradoxically makes it matter far more than it ever should have. And the real exposure lies in that contradiction, because on one hand, the message insists that separate bedrooms are normal, healthy, modern, and beneficial, while on the other hand, the delivery screams reassurance, as though someone somewhere feared that silence would invite speculation, and in trying to preempt that speculation, they've ended up amplifying it, drawing attention to the very thing they might have preferred to remain neutral, because once you tell the public how to feel about a detail, you confirm that the detail has symbolic weight whether you like it or not, and symbolism is something the royal brand has relied on for generations, which is why this moment feels particularly clumsy, because symbolism only works when it's consistent, and consistency is precisely what this story disrupts. Given years of carefully staged imagery projecting unity, stability, and almost theatrical togetherness, making this sudden pivot to modern detachment feel less like progress and more like narrative drift, and audiences are perceptive enough to sense when they're being invited to applaud a choice. Not because it's admirable, but because it needs approval. And that subtle difference changes everything, because approval-seeking erodes authority faster than scandal ever could. And the framing of this arrangement as a health necessity for the Princess of Wales only deepens that unease, because it introduces vulnerability in a way that feels instrumental rather than organic, positioning her well-being as both justification and shield, which may garner sympathy but also invites uncomfortable questions about why health narratives are selectively deployed when convenient. And that selective openness creates imbalance, where some topics are fiercely guarded while others are suddenly made public with expert endorsements attached, creating the impression that privacy is not a right but a lever, pulled when narrative pressure builds. And that is not transparency. It is strategy. And strategies are always visible to an audience that has grown increasingly skeptical of curated authenticity, particularly in an era where public figures are expected to either maintain distance consistently or embrace openness consistently, but not oscillate between the two depending on optics, because that oscillation reads as manipulation rather than modernity, and the insistence that separate beds are not a sign of marital trouble, while theoretically true, lands awkwardly because it assumes a level of suspicion that hadn't fully materialized until it was acknowledged, and by naming the myth so explicitly, the narrative inadvertently cements it in the public imagination, transforming a neutral fact into a topic of debate, analysis, and endless commentary, all of which could have been avoided through simple restraint. Yet restraint seems to have been sacrificed in favor of control, and control is rarely convincing when it's this visible. And then there is the broader cultural context to consider, where audiences are already fatigued by highly managed personas that claim relatability while maintaining emotional distance. And this story slots neatly into that fatigue, because instead of feeling like a glimpse of real life, it feels like a press-friendly vulnerability designed to soften an image without truly opening it. And that half measure is precisely what modern audiences resist, because they no longer reward proximity theatre, where intimacy is simulated but never truly offered, and the result is not outrage but quiet disengagement, the kind that erodes relevance over time, and relevance, once lost, is difficult to reclaim, no matter how many experts are quoted or narratives refined. And the gendered framing within the story also deserves scrutiny, because while it is presented as science-based and progressive, it subtly reinforces traditional dynamics by implying that one partner's habits are the disturbance while the other's needs must be accommodated, a framing that contradicts the modern equality the narrative appears to champion. And when you peel that back, you see a story that wants credit for being forward-thinking, while still relying on familiar tropes to make itself palatable, which again exposes inconsistency rather than growth. And inconsistency is the thread that ties all of this together, because from the selective use of privacy to the careful choice of validating voices, everything about this disclosure feels engineered rather than lived, and audiences instinctively know the difference, even if they can't always articulate it. And that instinct manifests as skepticism, not hostility, which is arguably more damaging because skepticism doesn't trend, it settles. It becomes background perception, influencing how every future narrative is received, and that's the real cost of careless exposure. Not immediate backlash, but long-term dilution of credibility. And when the public begins to view disclosures as tactical rather than truthful, even genuine moments are met with raised eyebrows instead of empathy, and that erosion doesn't happen overnight. It accumulates through moments like this, where something small is made large through over-explanation, and the attempt to normalize the choice by citing relationship experts ironically undermines the notion that normalization was ever needed, because the more voices are brought in to reassure, the clearer it becomes that reassurance was sought internally before it was offered externally, and that internal uncertainty leaks through the polished language, revealing an institution still struggling to reconcile modern expectations with traditional image control. And rather than bridging that gap, stories like this widen it, because they remind audiences that authenticity cannot be managed like a campaign. It must be embodied consistently. And when it isn't, every attempt to appear relaxed feels tense. Every attempt to appear open feels guarded. And every attempt to appear modern feels anchored to outdated methods of persuasion. And the irony is that none of this would have mattered if silence had been chosen, because silence, in this case, would have communicated confidence far more effectively than any expert quote ever could. Yet silence was abandoned, perhaps out of fear that others would fill it, and in trying to outrun speculation, the narrative ended up inviting it in through the front door, offering it context, commentary, and credibility. And once speculation is legitimized, it cannot be uninvited. It becomes part of the public conversation permanently, shaping perceptions long after the original story fades. And that permanence is the true risk of casual disclosure. Because while headlines move on, impressions linger, and the impression left here is not one of healthy modernity, but of a brand nervously adjusting its messaging in response to unseen pressure. And pressure, when visible, weakens authority. And authority is built not on perfection, but on coherence, which this moment lacks. And when coherence slips, even mundane details take on disproportionate weight, turning beds into symbols, sleep into statements, and domestic arrangements into reflections of institutional unease. And that transformation is entirely self-inflicted, not because of what was done, but because of how it was explained, defended, and staged for consumption. And that is why this moment feels less like progress and more like exposure, not the scandalous kind that fuels outrage, but the quiet kind that reveals how disconnected image managers can be from modern audience expectations. And that disconnect is perhaps the most revealing detail of all, because it suggests that despite years of lessons from public missteps and shifting cultural norms, the instinct to overmanage, over-explain, and overframe remains intact. And as long as that instinct drives communication, moments like this will continue to backfire, not dramatically, but persistently, chipping away at the very trust they aim to preserve until the public no longer reacts at all. And indifference, not criticism, becomes the defining response, which is the most unforgiving outcome any public figure can face. Because unlike outrage, indifference offers no path to redemption, only gradual irrelevance.